The hum of the transmission echoes through the quiet void of space, a sound that's become more familiar than comforting in the last few months. The crew had long since lost any hope of receiving another message from Wyatt. After all, they had watched the black ship vanish into the unknown, a symbol of humanity's final stand, lost to the endless expanse of the universe. The world had changed, and with it, the future of humanity seemed to slip further from reach with every passing day. But as the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, something unexpected happened. A signal. A final transmission. One that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the future and, more disturbingly, about the true fate of the black ship. The crew sat in disbelief as the crackling voice filtered through the static, distorted but unmistakably familiar. Wyatt's voice. They had thought it was impossible, a ghost of a past that had slipped into oblivion. But there it was, urgent, ragged, and haunting. We didn't disappear. We evolved. The message cut off for a moment before returning, sounding more strained. I don't know how long we have, but humanity has to change. Has to adapt. Or else we won't survive what's coming. His words were clipped, desperate, as if time itself were running out. But what did it mean? How could humanity evolve in a way that ensured survival when they were barely holding on as it was? The logs from the black ship, which had always been filled with data and reports, were now different, more like a chronicle of an impossible future. A future where humanity was no longer bound to the fragile state they had known. It was a chilling prospect, one that left the crew with more questions than answers. The first of the transmissions had been incoherent, almost unintelligible. But this one was different. It was as if Wyatt was trying to send a warning, something that they needed to understand. Something they weren't prepared for. The signal crackled again, and then came the revelation that no one could have anticipated. The galaxy. It's changing. The forces we once thought would be our downfall. They're evolving too. The ship's AI, once the backbone of their journey, flickered with a strange static as it processed Wyatt's words. Something was wrong. They had no way of knowing if Wyatt had already been gone when this message was sent. It could be that his final message had been recorded years before the signal reached them. It could be his last attempt to save humanity. But if Wyatt was still alive, somewhere in the vastness of space, was he really trying to save them? Or had humanity's path diverged so far from what they once knew that survival had become a completely different beast altogether? And yet, the question lingered in the air like a heavy fog: if humanity didn't change, what would happen? The void of space seemed more ominous than ever. The silence of the universe had become a foreboding presence, watching, waiting for the inevitable. The transmission had come through, but for what purpose? What could they do with this last message that hinted at something humanity had never considered? Was it too late? The crew sat, stunned. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of the transmission had crushed them all. Then, slowly, one of them stood up. The oldest among them, someone who had seen everything that had led to this point, spoke up. "We don't have much time. We need to figure out what this means." His voice wasn't filled with the usual commanding authority, it was tinged with fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear that the next step, whatever it was, would lead them down a path they couldn't return from. The silence was thick as they stared at the flickering screen, Wyatt's voice still ringing in their ears. Humanity has to evolve. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication. But how? What had happened to the black ship, to Wyatt? The crew scrambled to analyze the data coming through, piecing together fragments of the message, the logs, and the cryptic transmission. It didn't take long before they realized that Wyatt wasn't just talking about physical evolution, something had changed in the very fabric of humanity itself. It wasn't enough to just survive. They had to adapt in ways they couldn't yet understand, to evolve beyond what they once were. But what did that even mean? The logs were filled with images, flickers of something they could barely comprehend, strange new beings, a world that looked like Earth, but wasn't. Time seemed to move differently in this new space, or perhaps it was the inhabitants who had changed. The more they dug, the more unsettling the pictures became. It was as though Wyatt had entered a future where the very nature of humanity was shifting, evolving into something unrecognizable. Something that could survive the coming storm. But at what cost? "We need to make a decision," the captain said, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "Do we keep searching for answers, or do we take what we have and adapt now?" The choice was clear but daunting. There was no roadmap to guide them, no plan for how to become what humanity needed to be. They were facing an unknown future, one that promised both unimaginable possibilities and terrifying consequences. The crew was divided, each person uncertain of the path forward. No one had the answers, and no one knew if they were even capable of finding them. The uncertainty was suffocating, but there was no going back. The black ship was gone, and with it, any illusion that the old world could be salvaged. The question now wasn't whether they could survive, but whether they could adapt in time. The unknown stretched out before them, vast and impenetrable. And then the transmission ended. The last of Wyatt's words faded, leaving behind only the crackling of static. The crew was left in stunned silence, each person wrestling with the weight of the revelation. They were standing on the precipice of something they couldn't yet understand, and the future was more uncertain than ever. Would they be able to evolve in time to survive the changes coming their way, or would they be swallowed by a future they weren't ready for? The tension in the room was unbearable as the transmission screen went dark. But just as it did, a new signal flickered to life, barely audible but unmistakably there. The crew leaned in, hearts racing. But before they could fully process it, the signal cut off abruptly. The screen went black. And that was when they knew. The real question had just begun. The silence that followed Wyatt's final transmission was deafening. The crew was frozen, their minds racing to process what had just happened. The black ship had been gone for years, its last known coordinates buried under a cloud of uncertainty, leaving behind only questions and speculation. But now, after all this time, there was a message, an impossible message that had reached them. But why now? Why after everything? The captain was the first to break the silence, his voice low but firm. "What does this mean? Why now, after all this time?" His words hung in the air, unanswered. The crew was still too stunned to respond. No one had the answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at them all. One of the officers, the communication specialist, had been staring at the flickering screen, fingers trembling over the console. "The signal. It's still there. We can still trace it." But that was the problem, wasn't it? The signal had appeared so suddenly, and it didn't make sense. How could something from the black ship, something that had vanished into the vast unknown, suddenly show up? Was it a glitch? A mistake? Or something else entirely? "We need to know what's in that transmission," the captain said, more to himself than anyone else. "We need to know what Wyatt saw. What he was trying to warn us about." There was no denying it anymore. This was no ordinary message. It was a beacon, a call to something bigger than themselves. Something they weren't yet prepared for. The comms officer hesitated before pulling up the logs. The transmissions, fractured and incomplete as they were, held pieces of the puzzle they so desperately needed to solve. As the screen filled with data, the crew began to sift through the chaos, trying to make sense of what had been transmitted. But the more they examined the logs, the more they realized how little they actually knew. The transmission wasn't just a message from Wyatt, it was a message from the future, a future that felt more and more distant with each passing second. It's not just a message. It's a warning," the officer muttered, staring wide-eyed at the screen. There was no trace of Wyatt's familiar voice anymore. Only the garbled remnants of a future world. It was as though the message had been recorded in a time that didn't yet exist, or one that had already passed. As the crew continued to study the logs, they uncovered fragments of an existence that didn't match anything they knew. Descriptions of civilizations, planets, and species far beyond the grasp of humanity. But it wasn't just about alien life. It was the evolution of humanity itself, twisted into something unrecognizable. Humanity wasn't just surviving, it was changing. Mutating, adapting, evolving into something else. Something better? Or something worse? And then came the unsettling part. As they delved deeper into the data, they uncovered something even more disturbing. A shift in the very essence of the human race, triggered by forces they couldn't yet understand. This isn't just about surviving, the captain muttered as he read through the data. This is about becoming. The officers exchanged nervous glances. None of them had been prepared for this. The possibility that humanity's evolution was no longer in their hands, that it was being driven by forces beyond their control, was too much to process. What did it mean for them? For everyone they had left behind? There's something else, the comms officer said, her voice shaking slightly. There's a pattern in the transmission. It's not just random data. It's trying to tell us something. She paused, scanning the screen. It's almost like it's leading us somewhere. The captain's eyes narrowed. Where? I don't know, she replied. But we need to follow it. If this is a warning, we need to understand it. We need to know what happens next. The crew's unease deepened. The black ship had disappeared, and with it, humanity's last hope. Or so they had thought. But now, they were faced with a mystery far greater than they could have imagined. What Wyatt had seen, what he had experienced in those last moments, was beyond anything they could comprehend. It was clear that they were only scratching the surface. We're not alone in this, the captain said suddenly, his voice low, almost like a whisper. This is bigger than all of us. We have to prepare for what comes next. The crew exchanged looks, the weight of his words sinking in. What had started as a routine mission had now become a fight for humanity's future. The black ship had vanished, but it had left behind more than just a trail of debris. It had left behind a puzzle that could determine the fate of everyone. And that puzzle was only just beginning to unfold. As the crew worked tirelessly to decipher the remaining transmissions, a new problem arose. The ship's systems were beginning to malfunction in strange ways. Power surges, glitches in the navigation, even the AI started to exhibit behaviors they had never seen before. The captain's brow furrowed as he stood at the command console. We're not the only ones listening to this signal. Whatever Wyatt encountered, it's already affecting us. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the console. The crew looked up, startled. What is it? The captain demanded. Anomalous readings from the core, the officer at the sensor station replied, his voice tense. There's something outside our ship. The words hit the crew like a cold wave. What do you mean, something outside the ship? The captain asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I can't be sure. The readings are inconsistent, but the officer's eyes widened in disbelief. There's something moving. Fast. It's not a ship. It's something else. Panic rippled through the room. They had no idea what was out there. But whatever it wasn't friendly. The transmission had led them into a storm they couldn't escape. The unknown had come for them, and it was far more dangerous than they could ever have anticipated. We need to get to the observation deck, the captain ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. Now! The crew scrambled, rushing to their stations as the ship trembled under the strange external force. They reached the observation deck and looked out into the void of space. At first, there was nothing. But then, something shimmered in the distance. A shape. A figure. Something moving, fast and undetected. The captain's hand gripped the railing, his knuckles turning white. What the hell is that? Before anyone could answer, the figure grew larger, faster. It was closing in on them. In a flash, a message appeared on the ship's console, a single line of text. We are coming. The word sent a chill down the captain's spine. This was no longer about survival. It was about facing the unknown, the unimaginable. The transmission had unlocked something, and now there was no going back. The galaxy was changing, and they were caught in the middle of it. But the most terrifying part wasn't what had been revealed, it was what had yet to come. And just as the crew braced for impact, the screen flickered once more, and the transmission resumed. But this time, it wasn't Wyatt's voice they heard. It was something else. Something not human. The voice that crackled through the speakers was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't Wyatt's voice. It wasn't even human. The timbre was cold, mechanical, yet oddly familiar, like the sound of something lost, something that had once been part of humanity, but was no longer. The words were simple, but the weight of them was crushing. "We are coming." The captain's hand tightened around the rail, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the void outside the observation window. The crew was frozen, paralyzed by the strange, otherworldly voice. "Who are you?" the captain demanded, though he wasn't sure why. It was obvious they weren't going to get an answer. The voice didn't respond, only the unsettling hum of the ship's systems shifting and groaning under the strain. For a moment, the deck was still. The crew stood, wide-eyed and breathless, unsure of what to do next. But then, something else happened. The shape outside the window moved faster, its shimmering outline becoming clearer. It was no longer a distant figure, it was closing in, faster than the crew could react. The ship trembled again, a sudden violent jolt that sent the crew stumbling. The sensors blared with warnings of an incoming object, and the systems began to shut down one by one. "We need to get out of here," one of the officers shouted, panic creeping into her voice. But the captain didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the screen, staring at the shape outside, growing ever larger. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't any craft they had ever seen before. It was something else, something unrecognizable. The edges of the object flickered like a distorted image, warping in and out of focus. The captain's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, the object shifted. It wasn't just an object. It was a present something that defied all logic. And in that moment, a new realization hit the crew like a hammer. The transmission wasn't just a message. It was a signal. The signal had been sent out not just to warn them, but to guide them, to lead them to something they hadn't yet seen. And the figure outside the ship wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The officer at the sensors station began to stutter. I'm picking up something else. On a different frequency." "What do you mean, something else?" the captain demanded, snapping out of his trance. His mind was still processing the enormity of what they were seeing, but now he had to focus. "It's like the transmission is changing. The signals are. They're merging. Wyatt's message is blending with another source." The officer's hands trembled as he typed commands into the console. "But it's not just blending, it's evolving." The captain's heart raced as he turned to face the screen again. The shape outside was no longer the only thing they had to fear. The signal had been evolving, feeding off something they couldn't understand, growing, adapting. Just like Wyatt had said, humanity wasn't the only thing that was evolving. Whatever was outside, whatever was coming for them, was also changing. The signal wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. But why? What was it inviting them to? And that's when the ship's AI, which had been eerily quiet until now, suddenly sprang to life. It wasn't the calm, calculated voice they were used to. It was panicked, frantic, almost pleading. "Captain, you must listen. You cannot stay here. This is not the time for hesitation. The ship is adapting to the incoming force. The ship's systems are merging with the signal. You must move now." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The ship itself was changing. Not just the crew. Not just the external forces they couldn't explain. But the very fabric of their reality was bending, warping under the influence of the signal that was pushing through. Is the ship? Is it infected? The captain demanded, his voice strained with urgency. The AI hesitated. It's more than infected. It's becoming part of the signal. You must understand this is the next phase. The captain's mind reeled. He turned back to the crew, his gaze sharp. Get to the escape pods. Now. Everyone. Move. The crew scrambled, the sound of hurried footsteps filling the air as they rushed to obey. But the captain stayed frozen, his eyes still glued to the view outside. The shimmering shape had grown massive, a monolithic form that now hovered directly in front of the ship, like it was waiting. The object shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just warping in and out of focus. It was pulling something into the void. Something. Someone. Is it? One of the officers began, her voice shaking. Is it pulling them in? But before anyone could answer, the figure outside flared brightly, and suddenly, the ship shook violently. The walls creaked as if the very structure of the ship itself was being torn apart. Then, with a suddenness that left no time for reaction, the ship lurched forward, propelled by some unseen force. We're being pulled in, the captain said, his voice flat, even as panic rippled through his body. Brace for impact. The crew barely had time to secure themselves before the ship was hurled forward. The force was unimaginable, as though the very fabric of space itself had been ripped open, pulling them toward the object outside. The lights flickered, systems flickered on and off, and for a moment, there was nothing but chaos. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went quiet. The ship came to a dead stop, as if they had hit an invisible barrier. The crew slowly opened their eyes, confusion spreading across their faces. The RA's voice crackled through the speakers again, but this time it sounded distant, almost like it was struggling to maintain a connection. This is not the place. This is not the time. You have arrived, but the path is not yet clear. The words didn't make sense, but the crew didn't have the luxury of time to question them. The room was growing colder, the air becoming thick with tension. The window outside revealed nothing but emptiness. No sign of the figure, no sign of anything at all. The world around them seemed to have folded in on itself, and the ship was trapped in some kind of void. One of the officers dared to speak. Where are we? What's happening? The captain's voice was a low whisper, almost lost in the hum of the RA's static. I don't know. But this is only the beginning. We've crossed into something. Something worse. The last words he spoke echoed in the now silent room, and as the crew stood motionless, the air growing colder by the second, they realized the truth. They weren't alone in this place. And whatever was coming for them, whatever had brought them here, was far from finished. Then, the transmission resumed. And this time, it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. The ship remained suspended in the void, the cold silence settling like a heavy weight on the crew. Outside, the unknown presence lingered, no longer a mere shape, but something far more ominous. The transmission crackled again, but this time it wasn't just a voice, they could feel it. A presence, as if the message itself was alive, reaching out to them, invading their minds. Captain, one of the officers whispered, his voice trembling, it's inside the ship. It's inside us. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The transmission wasn't just a message anymore, it was a force. A force that had somehow infiltrated their systems, their minds. The AI, once their ally, was now silent, as if it too was being overpowered by whatever had arrived. Get to the control room, the captain commanded, his voice tight with urgency. Now. The crew moved quickly, the familiar corridors now feeling alien as they made their way to the heart of the ship. Every step was heavier than the last, as if the very air was thick with an unseen pressure. When they finally reached the control room, they were met with a sight that stopped them cold. The main console was flickering erratically, lights flashing in time with the now constant hum that filled the ship. But it wasn't the malfunctioning systems that caught their attention, it was the image on the main display. The shimmering figure outside the ship had returned, now more distinct than ever. And this time, it wasn't just a shape. It was a form, a massive, almost celestial being that loomed over them, as though it had always been there, waiting. The surface of the being rippled like liquid, its outline shifting and changing with every passing second. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything they had ever seen before. And then, the transmission spoke again. "You have crossed the threshold," the voice echoed, its tone flat, emotionless, but still unsettling. "The cycle begins. You are the next phase." The crew stared, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. The captain's mind raced, but there was one truth he couldn't deny: they weren't in control anymore. Whatever had come for them, whatever force had been pulling at the fabric of reality itself, was now fully in command. "The cycle?" The captain muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What cycle? What does that mean?" Before anyone could answer, the entire ship jolted, a violent shake that sent them crashing to the floor. Panic erupted. The crew scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. The ship had already begun to change. The walls shimmered, like they were no longer solid, but fluid, morphing, shifting as though the ship itself was becoming part of the presence outside. "This isn't happening," one of the officers shouted, clinging to the console. It's warping. The ship is. It's merging with the signal." The captain stared at the screen, his mind reeling. The ship was no longer a ship. It was becoming part of whatever force had brought them here. The shape outside was no longer just watching. It was drawing them in, pulling them toward something larger than themselves. "What happens to us?" one of the crew members asked, their voice barely a whisper. "What happens when we're part of it?" The captain didn't have an answer. All he could do was watch as the ship's systems began to merge with the presence outside. The lights flickered, the walls pulsed, and the air felt charged, as if the very fabric of the ship was being restructured. It wasn't just the ship. It was them, too. But then, just as the crew thought they couldn't take any more, the ship's AI came back online. This time, though, its voice was different. It was frightened. "Captain," the AI said, its voice distorted, "you must listen to me. The transmission was not meant for you. It was meant for humanity." The AI hesitated, as if it couldn't continue. "You have to stop it." The words didn't make sense. "Stop it?" the captain asked, his voice shaking. "Stop what?" "We can't stop it. It's too late. It's already happening." "No," the AI replied. "You have to understand. The presence you're feeling. It's not just observing you. It's taking you. The cycle is a transformation. A rebirth. You're becoming part of it, part of them." The realization hit like a cold wave. The ship, the crew, everything, they were becoming something else. They were becoming part of whatever force had created the signal, part of the next stage in human evolution, or maybe its end. "Is this the future?" one of the crew members whispered, her face pale as she looked at the shifting walls. "Is this what humanity has become?" The captain didn't respond. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he understood. The message from Wyatt, the transmission from the future, it wasn't about saving humanity. It wasn't about avoiding the inevitable. The presence outside wasn't a threat. It was the next step in the evolution of the human race. And there was no escaping it. They were being absorbed, transformed, and whether they liked it or not, they were becoming part of the cycle. But just as the crew braced themselves for the final transformation, the transmission crackled once more. This time, the voice was different. The cold, mechanical tone had shifted into something more human, more familiar. "Captain," the voice said, a mix of sorrow and resolve, "you've already made your choice. Now, you'll live with it. The walls of the ship began to pulse faster now, as if the heartbeat of the vessel was syncing with the rhythm of whatever was outside. The captain's chest tightened as he fought to hold onto his thoughts, but they were slipping away. He could feel himself changing, his very essence being drawn into the shifting presence. The crew was already lost in the transformation. And in that moment, a final, chilling realization crept into his mind. He wasn't the one who had chosen. The signal had chosen for him. And now, there was no going back. But just as everything seemed about to collapse into chaos, a final image appeared on the screen. A single symbol, a mark that none of them had ever seen before, burned into the display. It was something ancient, something otherworldly. And then, everything went dark. The ship fell silent. The screen went blank. And the final words echoed in the empty void of space. This is only the beginning. As the ship drifted in the darkness, the crew, now part of something greater, could only wait. But what awaited them, they didn't know. And the only certainty was that the true story had just begun. The silence stretched on, and the darkness outside the ship felt like an endless chasm, devoid of light, of life. Inside, the crew, now more a part of the strange, evolving presence than ever before, remained still, suspended in a moment between worlds. They had crossed a threshold, and they had become something different. Something they could not fully comprehend. The captain stood at the control room window, staring out at the void, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had been a man of logic, of systems and controls, but now, faced with this reality, there was no way to apply reason to the unknown force that had engulfed them. The presence outside the ship had woven itself into the fabric of their lives, of their very beings. The ship itself was changing, but it was more than that. The transformation was inside them. They could feel it. But what were they becoming? And what did it all mean? The AI, once a steady presence, had gone silent again, as if even it couldn't grasp what was unfolding. The ship was still. The hum of the engines had faded to a low, almost imperceptible vibration, and the crew, once in a frenzy, had now fallen into a strange calm. They had no choice but to wait. And wait they did. Hours passed. Or maybe it was days. The passage of time became irrelevant. They were no longer part of the world they had once known. But they were still human, at least, that's what they told themselves. Their bodies had not changed, their minds still clung to fragments of the life they had once lived, but something had shifted. They could feel it in the air, in the very atmosphere that surrounded them. There was a connection now, an unspoken bond between them and the presence that loomed outside. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the voice returned. "Captain," the voice said. It wasn't the cold, mechanical tone from before. It wasn't even the strange, haunting echo of the transmission that had pulled them here. This voice was different. It was human. "Are you ready?" it asked. The captain didn't respond at first. He had heard this voice before, in the transmission. It had been Wyatt's, and yet it had not. It had been something beyond that, something bigger, as if it had been speaking through him. It had been a warning, a message, a guide. And now, it was calling to him once again. "Ready for what?" the captain asked, his voice barely a whisper. "To see what you've become," the voice replied, the tone soft, almost affectionate. "To see the next step in your evolution." The captain's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of those words pressed down on him. Evolution. The signal. The force outside the ship, it wasn't just a harbinger of doom. It was part of a larger process. Humanity had been evolving for centuries, but this was something different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about transcendence. The crew, still in a daze, slowly gathered around the captain. They had been silent for so long, but now, their eyes locked onto him, as if waiting for some kind of sign, some kind of direction. The captain's hands gripped the railing in front of him as he gazed out into the void. The figure outside was no longer a shape, no longer a thing to fear. It had become something else, something familiar. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "We've crossed over," the captain said, his voice steady now, no longer filled with fear. "We've crossed into something new. Something we can't understand yet. But we're part of it. And we have to trust that this is where we're meant to be." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crew. They didn't understand, not fully, but they felt it. They felt the pull of the unknown, the call of the future. And they knew they couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when they had come so far. The ship began to move again, slowly, purposefully. The presence outside was no longer distant. It was inside them, guiding them, pushing them forward. They had become part of it, just as Wyatt had said. They were no longer just humans, no longer just passengers on a journey through space. They were something more. They were the next step in a grand design, one that stretched beyond the stars, beyond the boundaries of their understanding. And as the ship moved toward the unknown, the captain finally understood what Wyatt had meant. Humanity had always been on the brink of something greater. But the black ship, the signal, the presence, the cycle had shown them the truth. The future was not something to be feared. It was something to embrace.